Garcia Marquez. He was born on March 6, 1928 in Aracataca, a small village in Colombia. He was the oldest of 12 children who were all raised by their grandparents. He lived with an extended family of aunts who told many stories and myths that influenced his fiction later on. His grandfather was a retired colonel who was a most important figure in his life. Many of the aspects of his childhood are reflected in his fiction, such as old houses, civil wars, colonels, and banana companies. In 1946, he enrolled at the National University of Colombia in Bogota to study law. It was here that he began to write short stories. Most of his first short stories were immature and hard to understand, but they reflected the surrealism that his later fiction would entail. After Colombia's revolution, he began to work as a journalist and wrote short stories in his spare time. After years of working as a journalist in different newspapers and magazines, he eventually published his greatest work, which is 100 Years of Solitude. When writing this book, this 100 Years of Solitude, he actually locked himself away for about 1.5 years. So it kind of reflected his life at the time, I guess. The story that we read, Story of a Death Foretold, reflects his time as a journalist and his upbringing in a traditional rural village. Gabriel Garcia Marquez died last April in Mexico City.
Now I'm going to talk about Chronicle of Death Foretold based off of a true story. Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote an autobiography where he talked about the true story that inspired him to write the novel Chronicle of Death Foretold. His friend Mercedes Barcha, who is mentioned in A Chronicle of Death Foretold, relayed to him that their friend Cayentino was killed, and because it was in a small town, they knew that it could only be one person, which was Cayentino Gentile. The murder happened in Sucre, which was the small town where they all lived. So Marquez decided to go to Sucre to discover and get statements from the witnesses to figure out what actually happened. So as he started to collect statements from the witnesses, his mother asked him actually to put the story on hold out of respect for Donna Julieta, who was Cayentino's mother, and at least until she was alive. And so Marquez continued to gather statements kind of like on the down low, and he finds out that two brothers of the teacher in Chaparral knifed Cayentino outside of his house. And this woman, who was the teacher, was actually seen with Cayentino multiple times, riding on his horse, them spending the day together. Cayentino's mom thought that he was already inside of the house, so that's what made her rush to the door to lock it, because she thought he was already in his bedroom, so she was trying to keep him safe, when in reality she ended up locking him outside of the door, and that's when the two brothers came and stabbed him to death against this locked door of his house. Marquez had intentions of publishing the book immediately. However, he didn't do so out of respect for his mother, or Cayentino's mother. So 2 years after she had passed away, he published the book, which was actually 30 years after the tragedy itself. Marquez also felt that he couldn't live in peace if he didn't write this book. Cayentino was a soon-to-be doctor, he loved dancing, he was involved with trade, so he was very well known and well liked. Unfortunately, his mother never got over the death of Cayentino, of her son, before she passed. But in a way, I think that the book kind of helps him live on in a way, which is kind of odd because the story doesn't end well. But because the novel is going to be around forever, I just think that's kind of symbolic in itself.
Okay, so I'm just going to do the summary of the narrative, and the narrative outlines the events surrounding the murder of Santiago Nazar, and he's a young man who's thought to have taken the virginity of Angela Vicario, and she was married to Bayardo San Roman, who came over to find a bride. He's from a very prestigious, wealthy family, so Angela didn't really have a choice. Even though she didn't love him at the time, she had to marry him. And on her wedding night, after discovering that she wasn't a virgin, Bayardo actually returned her to her house, and that's when her two twin brothers, Pedro and Pablo, ask her who took her virginity, and she tells them it is Santiago Nazar. So in order to avenge their sister, they plan to find Santiago and kill him. So the narrator starts off by telling the story, telling us that what's going on in the household of Santiago Nazar on the morning he was murdered. And we learn that Santiago lived with his mother, the cook, and the cook's daughter. And his father had passed away 3 years previous. And he was an Arab man who had the family ranch, which he passed down to Santiago. And that was why they were very wealthy and known to be wealthy in the community. So the day that Santiago was murdered was a significant day in town because the bishop was coming by boat. This was to bless the marriage of Angela and Bayardo. So many people were heading over to the dock to see the boat, and the bishop arrived, and Pedro and Pablo were sitting there at the local milk shop, and this was because they were waiting for Santiago when he was either coming or going. And even though they repeatedly announced that they had intentions to murder Santiago, many people, such as the butcher and the police officer, they all thought that the twins were largely bluffing. So the owner of the milk shop even told the priest about what the twins were threatening to do, and however, because of all the excitement with the bishop coming, he completely forgot about the warning. So the narrator then tells how his friend searched frantically for Santiago the morning of the murder, but was unable to find him because he did not realize that Santiago had actually gone to his fiancée, Flora Miguel's house. Her father was the first to warn Santiago of the murder, but at this point there were crowds of people outside who came to see the bishop, but began to linger because they knew that Santiago was planned to be killed. So after he left Flora Miguel's house, Santiago was very confused. When he heard one of his friends yell to him to run, he ran about 50 yards to his front door, and that's when the brothers easily caught up to him and stabbed him right out front of his house in his front door. So after the murder, the entire family, the Vicario family, left town because of the disgrace the combination of both events had brought upon their family. So after about a week of the murder, Bayardo San Roman left with his family, and they came and retrieved him by boat. So the brothers were in prison for 3 years, and after the release from prison, Pablo got married, and Pedro went back into the armed forces. After Bayardo returned Angela to her home on their wedding night, she fell in love with him. After she moved away from town where she was disgraced, she wrote him letters every week for 17 years, and eventually he returned to her. For years after the crime, it was all anyone in town ever spoke of, and we never really know if Angela was really telling the truth about Santiago taking her virginity.
Okay, so throughout A Chronicle of Death, Foretold, there are two major themes presented. The first one is the theme of ritual, which was common in Latin American culture. Bayardo San Roman forms a courtship with Angela Vicario without getting to know her. Everything his future bride asks for, he presents to her. He also surprises her with a music box inlaid with mother of pearl. He does all this for her to demonstrate his wealth and power. In Latin American culture, affluence outweighs personality, which is traditional with Latin American marriages. Another example of ritual as a theme is the novel style. The story does not follow a traditional narrative style, but rather is told for the liberating assessment of the art of telling. The novel is told as a typical ritual of investigation, with the narrator only knowing as much as we are presented. Honor is also a theme that is represented throughout the novel. The town in which this novel takes place seems to be heavily honor-oriented. One who is not honored in the community is viewed as an outcast. Nobody questions any of the actions taken out of respect. For example, the Vicario twins kill Santiago Nazar out of honor for their sister Angela. After dishonoring her husband and family by not being a virgin, the brothers feel Santiago Nazar must be killed to restore the family name. Although many people are aware of the murder plot before it plays out, Almost everyone turns the other cheek to anything they heard about it because they feel the crime should be punished. When it comes to the court ruling, the murder is viewed as a respectable retribution because of what had happened. Sleeping with an unmarried woman was viewed as a serious wrongdoing because it would ruin that woman's chances of advancing in the world. Magical realism is an important element in literary style that is typically used in Latin American writings. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, magical realism incorporates fantastic or mythical elements into otherwise realistic fiction. Gabriel Garcia Marquez uses magical realism throughout his novel to highlight different events with whimsical details. For example, the opening of the book starts with the description of a dream Santiago Nazar is having. It reads, "He dreamed he was going through a grove of timber trees where a gentle drizzle was falling, and for an instant he was happy in his dream, but when he awoke he felt completely spattered with bird shit." With such surreal and strange details, the reader must establish the difference between reality and fantasy. Does anybody have any questions about the story?
Why do you think Gabriel Garcia Marquez was so passionate about writing the story?
Well, I think because Cayetano was a good friend of his and he knew him very well, that he kind of wanted to kind of give like a justice for Cayetano. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, I think he was very, with his journalism side into the whole investigating thing and wanted to kind of cover the story in a different way than just a journalistic view, put a little story behind it.